Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So I know it's a bit soon to do another traditional video, but I wanted to do a little bit of watercolor painting today. I think I briefly mentioned it in Monday's video where there was a watercolor piece that I was low-key avoiding. Mostly for the reason that I was a little bit nervous to actually approach the painting. So on the screen right here, I am showing you guys the kind of like printed sketch alongside with the time lapse that I ended up doing. And we are going to be, I guess, like removing this piece of Selwyn that I did, I think, I don't know, last week for that session. And we're going to be using this Baohong watercolor paper pad. But because it is a block, I do have to remove Selwyn so that we can access the next page underneath it. So if you're unfamiliar with like watercolor blocks, usually all the sides of the block are gummed together, so all your sheets are basically stuck together, and it just helps with making sure that your painting dries completely flat. It helps with warping and all that. But you can find like usually a little section where there is a non-gummed part and stick some sort of like flat object. I'm using an X-Acto knife or like a box cutter. Sometimes I use like a paint scraper, anything like that you can slip in between and cut away from, I guess, like the glue from the rest of the block. Then we have this fresh new sheet that we can work on. So the drawing that I did of FLINS, which is this character that I drew right here, he's from Genshin Impact, and it's just a character that I really like. I like his entire vibe, his design, and he kind of reminds me of Chandelure, which is one of my favorite Pokemon personally. But I wanted to do kind of like a different kind of lighting, which we'll get into in a bit. So to kind of prep everything for the watercolor piece, because I'm working on a watercolor block, I am actually not able to use a light pad underneath to shine my sketch through and transfer it that way. So to make kind of like a makeshift carbon paper, I'm scribbling using the Prismacolor Col Erase on the back of my sketch, just basically in the sections where I know that has any lines present. We're going to flip it back over, stick it to my watercolor sheet, and I'm just going to use some tape to kind of like make a hinge so that we make sure our piece is just going to be perfectly aligned every time I need to move it, because I will be double checking every so often to see that my lines are actually being transferred. So using a ballpoint pen, and luckily I remembered to change my sketch to be a different color from black so that when I'm using I guess like a different pen of any color, I can actually see which lines I've already placed down, and I'm applying pressure with the pen. It just helps having a color so that you don't lose your place and you don't miss any lines. But you can use anything that has more of like a blunt end and basically press down on the paper to make imprints to kind of press the red onto the watercolor paper. So that's kind of like my makeshift carbon paper that I'm going to be using. I know it's probably easier just to buy carbon paper, but I think it's just easier for me to just scribble on the back with some sort of fairly transferable type of coloring medium, I guess. I do recommend that it's a color that you don't mind that might show up in your painting, if that makes sense. Like if you're going to have like a really light color palette, try to avoid colors that you don't really want present in it because your watercolor might not be able to cover it up. Or if you have access to anything that's more like water soluble, maybe you can use that, because the next step after transferring my kind of like red sketch or like my preliminary sketch, I always do another version of using just a normal HB mechanical pencil to do more cleaner lines, because I know those ones will not dissolve in the water. But all of this is kind of like personal preference. I think I have done a piece, and I think I've done it for a video in the past, where I've transferred using graphite on the back, and it just got very messy. I feel like it left too much debris in general, and I was getting more like faded lines. So when I applied my first wash of watercolor over top the entire piece, I was spreading around a lot of the graphite anyways. So I like using the Prismacolor Col Erase one. It doesn't leave too much like residue, and it's like it shows up just enough for me to understand what my lines were in my digital sketch. So now we are on the step of kind of picking and choosing my clean lines. So because the red is quite faint and I know I want to have an easier time seeing my sketch, I am going to be going over it with pencil, because I know this technically won't budge. I don't really mind too much if the pencil shows through here, because I will be doing line art over top of it with watercolor anyways, and this one in particular is going to have like a fairly dark color palette, so a lot of these lines are probably going to disappear regardless. So if you're wondering why I do this method rather than just sketching directly onto the paper itself, there's like a few reasons. One main reason is damaging the paper. So having either maybe you're digging your pencil a little bit too hard into the paper, or your eraser is like picking up the fibers of the paper, you're kind of destroying the surface. I find that this is more common, at least for myself, on hot press paper or like 100% cotton paper. I never really had this problem when I was working with cold press because of the rough texture, and oftentimes the ones that I was using was not like pure cotton or like 100% cotton, so like a lot of those little tiny fibers weren't as present. So when I erased, it didn't really affect the texture too much. I wasn't really ruining the paper. So when I used to do like a lot of 17 portraits in watercolor, I actually sketched directly on the paper with the Pilot Color Eno, usually in the color red or the photo blue. And then I would just paint over top, being very careful. And at that point, I don't think I ever added the graphite kind of line art sketch over top for those ones, just because for realism, I don't really like having really prominent lines showing up. So I didn't really do that step. But kind of with the sketch done and out of the way, I am going to be picking out a few colors to start off with my wash. So I actually went ahead and used my gigantic 2-inch hockey brush to lay down a layer of water. One, to help seal in the lines a little bit, because I'm going to be adding a lot of more brush strokes on top of the paper, so I don't really want the graphite to be moving too much. But also I want to make sure that we can blend our colors a little bit more seamlessly. I don't do the best job here because I spent a little bit too much time trying to mix up the appropriate colors that I wanted for my initial layer. So if I don't have like a very strong sense of lighting or direction that I want to go with for the piece, I often gravitate towards using like a yellow or an orange as the base for my painting, because I do like the warmth of it oftentimes. But for this one, because we are going to be going dark and I want the light source to be more or less from the lantern, I wanted to make sure that I could leave the lantern more or less bright, and then everywhere else has more of that blue to purple kind of hue. Also, I was a bit lazy. I didn't really want to run up to go grab my hairdryer, so I'm just using a little desktop fan to dry my piece. Unfortunately, there are some areas that had more water pilling or like piling up in one area. So, or not piling up, what am I saying? Pooling in one area. So I do have some areas that look like it has like a circle ring around it. So the water is basically drying in a different way, and it's kind of pushing the pigments towards the edge, which is why you get like the little hazy circle effect in some areas. Now, I was nervous in terms of like wanting to start this piece, and my fears kind of came true because I made a very poor decision of being a little bit too timid and immediately putting down some sort of peachy beige kind of skin tone on top of the purple and the blue. So technically it's not like a bad choice if you wanted just like a blue purple undertone throughout everything, but because I was dealing with light, I should have left the face with the kind of like blue purple that I initially had placed down, and actually intensified the blue a lot more rather than immediately putting down some sort of skin tone that's on the warmer side. But because I was panicking a bit, I decided to switch gears and just work on the lantern first. Sometimes objects are a little bit less intimidating for me to paint, just because the face is a bit more delicate and tends to be a place where people tend to put their most focus on. So working on the lantern just felt like a little bit more like low stakes compared to everything else. But you could kind of see I was trying to correct my mistake, and I keep touching the face. I added a layer of blue over top of the beige that I initially put down, or like the peachy color, and it dried in a weird manner. I keep trying to fix it. I fixed it again right here. So what I should have done is added a layer of blue, and then later on we will add darker and darker shadows that will lean towards more of like a purple, even hitting towards gray, because unfortunately, because I didn't lift up the peach color, the peach and the blue were mixing and they were not providing a very good amount of like that blue vibrancy that I would have wanted if we had more of like a glowing blue light. So unfortunately, I don't think I painted the face super well. I think I do end up salvaging it slightly at the end, but to be honest, I just made the face a little bit too dark for something that should be illuminated, especially on the left side of the face when you're looking at my paper. because me layering up another blue on top was just like a darker blue than what was on the kind of lantern or even like any of the other surrounding areas, which doesn't really make sense because like I said, it should be more illuminated, so it has to have that more bluish glow, or even like a purple glow would have been okay and would have sufficed, but it got a little bit too dark because I started off with the peach and then I added blue. It got muddy. I didn't lift any of the colors, and then I kept adding and adding more and more to try to correct it. So that's a mistake that I should keep in mind next time. But I definitely think I was too timid to try this. I should have done like a color comp right away, like on Procreate, more thoroughly, because the one that I did, which you guys would have saw at the very beginning when I was showing you the time lapse, it wasn't a good color comp. It was an okay one. I think if I was more experienced in terms of knowing what colors I wanted to mix prior, then that kind of color comp would have sufficed. But because I was too nervous and I wasn't too sure the direction that I wanted to do, kind of like the blue lighting on top of his entire color palette, I should have done like a normal color palette of just how his colors actually are, applied a few filters to see how I feel like adding more of like a blue light or like adding a blue hue to everything to see what color actually comes up, and then translating that into watercolors. Probably would have been a better approach, but for this one, it's still like a good practice at least to try to focus most of my energy on making sure that there is some sort of semblance of illumination from the lantern and making everything else kind of darker and darker as we go along. Okay, so I think this is where I attempt to fix the face again. So I tried to make another blue color. As you can see, it's more of like a blue-green rather than like a blue-purple, but I was trying my best to see if I could combat that yellowiness without making it too muddy. So to also help push the blue to make sure it doesn't look too dark, I wanted to add an extra shadow on the face on the right-hand side to see whether or not I have enough contrast. Also, my mic is like slowly sinking. What is happening? So maybe in the future, if I have time and sketch out a new one of FLINS, because I'm not in love with my sketch either. I do like the idea of having his face just illuminated by the light, but I would like to do something where he's not just like front facing, because that's also throwing me off a little bit. I think it's also because I like painting the eyes a lot, but his eyes are just purely blank yellow eyes. I didn't really add in, I think he's like a slight sliver of red near the edge of his eyelids. So I should have, or not eyelids, like the outer corners of his eyes have kind of like a little bit of red showing through, and I did not add that in. I think it's because I was trying to salvage everything to the best of my ability. I think at this point I was fine in terms of like where it was, because I was able to push some of the values to be a little bit darker, define the face slightly more, and then he's looking a little bit less flat in this case, or at least I'm hoping, because the one thing I was worried about is that if I was not able to salvage the face, it's gonna really make me not want to finish this. But I think it's at an okay point. Like I said, it doesn't really look like it's particularly illuminated by the lantern. It just feels like maybe overall there's just like a blue and purple haze or something that he's in, where it's like affecting how we're viewing the entire color palette, because it is too dark. I should have started maybe with just a full-on blue wash, added my purples where I needed it, and then added purple shadows like immediately, or blocked in everything with purple to figure out how I wanted the values to look, and maybe that would have helped as a good base. That, or I should have immediately lifted the beige kind of like brownish red tone that I initially put down on his face to see if I could salvage it at that point, because this paper, as much as I like hot press paper and I feel like the pigments and the water absorb fairly quickly actually, so oftentimes I'm left with these splotchier areas compared to watercolor, cold press paper, which I think has a little bit more forgivingness because of the texture of like that bumpiness. So a lot of my colors I feel like just blend a little bit more smoother, or at least like visually it looks kind of like that. But I always liked working on hot press paper when I started doing more line art with using watercolors. But this paper does have the ability to, at least like if you take your time to scrub at the paper and blot it, you can lift color off. So I should have just lifted off the beige. But at this point, we are going to be moving on. So I have majority of what I wanted painted. I am going to be darkening things a little bit more, but I wanted to show you guys the brush. So I talked about this briefly. Some people suggested me reshaping it using like, I think it's a soap or a glue, I forget what it is, but you can reshape your brush hairs. And I feel like it would help. I don't know if maybe the brush was always like this and I just haven't painted in a long time. So I was just keep fighting with the brush hairs. Because I mentioned before that there's like a kind of like a curly cue at the very end of my brush. So using the curve sometimes throws me off. But I think it's also just my application, because oftentimes when I'm using the brush and I'm lifting it off from the surface, I think I'm just maybe pressing down before I'm lifting off. So it kind of like bounces back, which makes like a slight thicker blot on the paper rather than just having that thinner line, because sometimes I do get my thinner lines and sometimes I don't. But at this point, I'm like kind of hoping that the liner kind of saves everything. I know I shouldn't rely on the liner like this to save everything, but oftentimes it puts enough contrast and gives it a nice, more finished look compared to what I had initially, especially for his eyes, where because they're blank and they don't really have detail or like highlights or anything like that anywhere super present, I wanted to make sure that it had at least a little bit more definition if I added in, you know, liners for the upper eyelid and then the lower lid, and just like making sure that the shape of his iris are more or less like, you know, symmetrical for the most part. But I had most fun doing the lines probably for the lantern and then like bits and bobs for his outfit. So approaching this painting, I knew initially when I did my sketch, I was going to be painting the background more dark, and I thought I was going to adhere to kind of like the rectangular box that I initially had it in. But as I started doing the painting and when I put down the red on the back of the paper, I thought maybe it'd be better for me just to leave it more open-ended and leave some areas maybe like incomplete or they could fade out rather than making it all contained inside of a rectangle. Because if I made it within a rectangle, I would definitely tape it off with washi tape or like painter's tape so that we have like a nice clean, crisp edge. But hopefully these close-up shots kind of give you a little bit more insight of how I end up doing line art a little bit. Sometimes I do get like a lot thicker lines and sometimes my paint is a little bit more watery. But whenever I'm doing details like near the face or the hair, I try my best to get like thinner lines and make sure that the paint to water ratio is definitely more in favor of the paint so that the lines are just nice and opaque and dark. But when I was doing stuff for like the lantern, certain portions of the clothing, I did end up diluting my paint even more so that I could fill in some more areas and just have kind of like darker shadows even more. But definitely areas like the hand, I think the lantern, portions of his clothing definitely needed that extra oomph from the line work. I don't think it affected the face too much. Like, yes, it helps just like make the eyes pop a little bit or like push the hair back from the face just a smidge. But I think everywhere else that had more of like dark purple just needed a little bit more definition to make sure that nothing kind of like blends and melds into one another. I do think that I ended up losing the shape of my lantern a bit because of the handle kind of going into the palm and then where he's gripping. There's like a weird area where it looks like it's merging all together, unfortunately. I think it's also because like during my sketch, I was just unsure how I wanted him to be holding the lantern. Mostly for the reason that I might have drawn the kind of like handle or the entirety of the lantern at this point because it's in front of him a little bit too small. So his hand also just looks too small, and I think I was trying to cram all his fingers into the handle portion so it actually looks like he's trying to grip it rather than, you know, potentially just making the lantern bigger so that his hand is more proportionate to everything else. But I do like the fact that the kind of like center portion or like the glowing, the most brightest part, I guess, of the lantern does have kind of like, I don't know, there's a nice light quality to it, but I also do like the crisp edge of where that blue is, just giving it a little bit of shape and form. I wish if I knew how I wanted that to look in particular, then I would have made it look a little bit more like flame-like. My brain is like not making me able to speak right now for some reason. I don't know I'm just struggling. But what I meant was, if I had more planning and forethought prior to painting and just knowing how I wanted things to look, I would have planned that shape to look more like a flame in the center. And I think that would have contributed towards having like that glowy kind of light, making it look more like a flame rather than just like a glowing bottle or something with inside of a lantern. But I was also a little bit too timid. I could have definitely intensified maybe the purple and the blue, at least at the top and the bottom of our little lantern glass, so that we could have the center become just a little bit more brighter because of the contrast. So that would have been nice to do, but I didn't want to like screw up any more of the lantern because I already disliked the face. So the only part I liked at this point was the lantern. But I think like in the future, I might look into getting like another watercolor journal or a watercolor block of a smaller size, because a part of me thinks that I don't paint as much also because I don't want to waste this paper. So even me just using like half this sheet for the most part, and I have the rest of the portion to use on the other side, I want to be able to experiment with watercolor a little bit more without feeling too precious with this paper. I'm pretty sure Baohong has like other ones, so I'll definitely look into it. I'm also like going to be out of the country next week, so I think I might actually be able to find it in person, so because I'm going to be in Asia for a little bit. Also, back to the painting, I forgot I filmed like the entire outro and stuff with this painting thinking I was done, but I forgot that to make the lighting make a little bit more sense where he's illuminated and I made his hair probably significantly darker and all that jazz, I needed the background to be much darker. I wish I planned this a little bit more at the very beginning because I definitely lose some of the shapes for his hair and just like some of that detailing. Well, there was not that much, but like I should have planned it a little bit more so that things just look a little bit more cohesive. I don't mind that's a little bit more messy and there's like that texture flowing out everywhere. Added a little bit more water at the very bottom to kind of give it more of that blooming edge effect as well, so it's not too straight. But yeah, here's kind of the end of our little painting session. I hope you guys enjoyed me just experimenting, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!